Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our final Monday evening Zoom session for this course. And so we are in week 6 out of 6. What we have left to cover in the course, two main topics, managing human resources and managing fiscal resources. So the first half of class tonight, we'll talk about managing human resources, pick up where we left off last week, talking about career civil service and where the career civil service came from. We'll talk about the different functions in the management of human resources. Second half of class tonight, we'll talk about how we manage fiscal resources. I'll introduce you to different types of budget formats. We'll talk about operating versus capital budgeting. We'll talk about some of the ways in which the federal budget process has changed and the way the federal budget process works, kind of as a guide to how the process then works here in the state of California. So that will be the second half of class. We'll see how we progress time-wise. Those are the final two topics for this course. So if we get through all that information tonight, then we will not need to have a live Zoom session on Saturday. And instead, what we can do is just reserve Saturday as time for you to complete your final two assignments for the course, Canvas essay number 5, and then the final assessment. Canvas essay number 5 is you'll be looking at the public policy information that we covered last week and decision-making models. And you will be selecting one public policy that you are familiar with or interested in, and then think about how that policy was formulated and what type of decision-making model, rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, garbage can, which of those decision-making models were most appropriate to describe the formulation for that policy. And then if one of those four models is actually, you think, more appropriate than the model that was used in formulation. So that's Canvas essay number 5, both your initial post as well as your responses to classmates. Those need to be posted no later than midnight on Saturday, March the 8th. And then you have that final assessment that we talked about last week. The information we'll cover tonight, management of human resources and management of fiscal resources, will provide you with all the information you need then to complete all 5 of those scenarios, all 10 questions on that final assessment. And then that final assessment is also then due by midnight on Saturday. So looking at what we have to cover tonight and the time allotted for it, I'm very confident that we'll be able to get through everything this evening so that on Saturday, instead of being here at 9 o'clock in the Zoom session, you can just have that day to finish up those final 2 assignments. Then what will happen is once you get those assignments submitted on March the 8th, then I will go through and review those, and then I'll have your final grades ready to be uploaded, hopefully by next Monday, the 10th. I may have to prompt the university to go ahead and open the grading roster because sometimes they're not really in alignment with our class schedule, and they don't kind of realize that we have classes that end in the middle of what they consider to be their traditional spring semester. But it's usually just an email or two to prod them to open up the grading roster, and then I'll be able to get your final grades uploaded sometime very early next week. Then you get a little break, and your next class then begins 2 weeks from Saturday on the 22nd. And in that class, you'll then move into 577. If you haven't received the syllabus for that class yet, you'll be receiving it very soon. I will talk to the instructor early next week, make sure that he has everything all ready to go, and get that syllabus and your textbooks, what the required textbooks are, out to you as soon as possible. So that's where we currently are. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off last week. Last week, in the very last part of class, we talked about the career civil service system and where civil service came from. And I kind of walked you through the main 3 eras of public employment: the era of gentlemen from the late 1700s until 1828, then the era of spoils from 1828 until 1883 with the passage of the Pendleton Act. And then with that passage of the Pendleton Act in 1883, we then entered into our 3rd era, known as the era of merit. Also in that discussion of the era of merit, we talked about this major overhaul of civil service that happened in 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act. And when we talked about the Civil Service Reform Act, we talked about 5 different organizations that came out of that Civil Service Reform Act. One of those, the OSC, the Office of Special Counsel, is still very much in the headlines today. And as I told you last week, The president had dismissed the head of the Office of Special Counsel, essentially fired that individual. That individual then brought suit against his firing. And just a couple of days ago, we had a federal judge that put a stay upon that firing, saying that the firing of the head of the Office of Special Counsel, that was not a legal firing. So now we're going to have that case move its way up to the Supreme Court, most likely. Hopefully, it'll get to the Supreme Court very quickly on an expedited schedule. I'm very sure, I could be wrong about this, but I'm very sure the Supreme Court will issue what they call a writ of cert. And a writ of cert means that they are willing to hear the case. And that probably will happen relatively quickly. And then the Supreme Court will chime in on whether or not the firing of this head of the Office of Special Counsel is something that is certainly within or not within the purview of a president of the United States. And so a lot of these things that we talk about, it's not just, well, it's something that happened in 1978. It's actually something that is alive and well in the headlines today. We talked about the federal civil service system. We talked about the general schedule and what the GS levels look like in the general schedule and the advantages and disadvantages of having a career civil service system, which then all leads us to our topic in the first half of class here tonight, which is, now that we have this civil service system, how do we manage personnel within that civil service system in the public sector? So tonight in the first half of class, we will go through the different functions that you engage in doing the human resource management function. Now, we know that about 85 to 90% of all agency budgets comprised by the human resource management function, whether it be in terms of salaries or benefits. You're looking at 85 to 90% of the public money that you are spending is targeted toward this idea of managing personnel within this career civil service system. So clearly, human resource management is one of the primary things that we do on a daily basis as public administrators. Now, I know some of you work in the field of HR, and so you're very familiar with how you do the HRM functions. Some of you, even if you do not work in human resources, you're still being affected by how human resources are managed, because you are a human resource in your agency at the federal, the state, or the local level. We have seen a lot of centralization of the human resource management functions, in that because of our system of career civil service and all the regulations that come along with a career civil service system, combined with all the provisions in a collective bargaining agreement that we also have to deal with because of the high rates of unionization of public employees, there are a lot of limitations and a lot of rules and processes we need to adhere to when we are managing personnel. Because of all those rules and regulations, many organizations have found it useful to centralize the human resource management function within a centralized human resource office. So rather than having line managers do this type of human resource management, now we kind of leave it to the professionals, so to speak, in HR offices. So it's been very much of a centralization in these HR offices in recent years. But it's still important for all of us as public administrators to understand what the human resource management process is like. So the different functions we are going to cover tonight in human resource management, we're going to start with procurement. You need to procure the human resources into your organization if you are going to be able to properly staff your organization. We know that procurement, the staffing function, this is one of the primary management, generic management functions that Graham Allison told us about in his article. So every manager is going to engage in staffing. Staffing is procurement. Once you have procured the resources, you've gotten people into your organization, then you must allocate and divide up the work among people within your organization. Max Weber told us how important division of labor was in his idealized bureaucracy. So the second main function is, how do we divide up this work? How do we allocate this work throughout our organization? Then the third primary function is training and development. If we're truly doing human resource management, then we are very interested in developing these individuals as human resources. So we're no longer in the classical school. Now we are in the School of Human Resource Management, where we want to provide them these opportunities to engage in professional development so they can develop their skills and to develop as human resources to do what Abraham Maslow referred to as to self-actualize, to essentially be all they can be, to essentially achieve their utmost potential. Then the fourth function is discipline and sanctioning. And so if we evaluate individuals and they are not performing up to the standards that they're expected to perform to, we provide them training and development opportunities, and that still does not enhance their performance levels. Over a period of time of documenting subpar performance, then we may be able to move into the fourth function, which is discipline and sanctioning. So procurement, allocation, training and development, discipline, and sanctioning are the four primary functions of human resource management that we are going to talk about tonight. So let's start with procurement, getting people into your organization, staffing up your organization. So the first step there is obviously recruitment, locating those essential human resources to bring into the organization. This is where we know that this generic management function of staffing becomes much different between the sectors. We know there are major differences between public sector recruitment and private sector recruitment. If you are working in a federal, state, or local agency, when you got your position, it probably was not an immediate hire. It took some time for you to get that position. It may have taken a few weeks, it may have taken a few months, it may have taken up to a year in order to be recruited into your position. The reason for that is that the recruitment process in the public sector focuses on more than just effectiveness and efficiency. While effectiveness and efficiency are important for us, we are also very concerned about creating a representative bureaucracy. We're very concerned about maintaining the values of social equity and social justice. And so we need to make sure that we can create the most diverse applicant pool that we can possibly create. To create this diverse applicant pool, we usually engage in targeted recruitment, where we will fashion the position announcement so that it encourages applications from members of underrepresented communities. We will advertise through targeted advertising in sources that will enhance the diversity of our applicant pool. And just to give you an example of what we go through here at Long Beach, I may have mentioned this before, but hopefully this spring, I will know as of next week whether or not we are approved for a new tenure track faculty hire. We haven't gotten one for 4 years now. But when you do go out there to hire a tenure track faculty member, since we are a public institution and we value things beyond just those two values that you see in the private sector, we want to create as diversified a faculty as we possibly can. A diversified faculty that represents the diversification of our student body. So we engage in our targeted recruitment. We have to follow a lot of steps and do it in concert with the Office of Equity and Diversity. So if our tenure track line gets approved, one of the first things I will need to do is put together a position announcement. In that position announcement, I will have to craft that position announcement so that it is highly inclusive of all communities, to make sure that we are especially encouraging applications from people who represent underrepresented populations. I will need to put together a recruitment plan. And in that recruitment plan, I will need to specify the targeted recruitment avenues that we are going to use to try and diversify our applicant pool. So traditionally, what we have done in the past is I would advertise not just in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education, not just in places like publicsectorcareers.org, which is one of the primary job listing services for public sector positions. We would also advertise in targeted sources such as the ASPA section on women in public administration, the National Federation of Black Public Administrators, National Federation of Black Political Scientists. There is a Latina section in ASPA as well. We would advertise within. There's also a section within NASPA that we would advertise with. So we do that type of targeted outreach in order to make sure we get as diverse of an applicant pool as possible. That recruitment plan must be approved by our Office of Equity and Diversity. Once it's approved, and that usually happens in around June or so, by July, we are then advertising in all these different sources, usually with an application deadline sometime in mid to late September. Then whenever we get these applications by mid to late September, we then put together our applicant pool. That applicant pool then must be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity as well to make sure that there is enough diversity in that initial applicant pool. If that initial applicant pool is not diverse enough, then we would be told to go back out and re-advertise again for another couple months until we can get more diversity in the applicant pool. The past 2 tenure track hires we have had when I was department chair, our applicant pool was approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity, so we didn't have to go back out and re-advertise. But once that applicant pool is then approved, you then also need to get your questions that you're going to be using in your semifinalist interviews approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity as well. So we then, once we have our interview questions approved, we would then have a committee that reviews the applicant pool. We would then create a list of semifinalists. Typically, we have anywhere from about 6 to 12 semifinalists, and we would then conduct Zoom interviews with those 6 to 12 semifinalists, or the committee would, using those questions that have been approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Before we can do those semifinalist interviews, though, that semifinalist pool would also have to be approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity. Once those semifinalist interviews are completed, then we'll put together a list of 3 finalists to invite to on-campus interviews. That list of 3 finalists, once it's approved by the Office of Equity and Diversity, we would then conduct those final interviews. And then of those 3 candidates, we would then make a recommendation to the dean and to the Office of Equity and Diversity for a final approval. So our initial advertisement will go out sometime in July, early to mid-July, and then we're probably issuing our final job offer to our successful candidate sometime in early to mid-February. If everything goes well, person will have a deadline to accept the job of usually the beginning of March. So the process is run from the beginning of July in terms of advertising all the way until the beginning of March. Even if you want to back it up to when the authority was received to hire to begin with, that authority would be received in about 2 weeks from now. So the entire process from having the tenure track hire process approved just to be allowed to go out there and hire all the way until issuing the final offer would be about 1 year. So that just kind of underscores for you how long and how protracted the hiring process oftentimes is here at Cal State Long Beach as a public organization. And that kind of mirrors a lot of other public organizations as well. When you are hiring someone in the public sector, it's much different than hiring someone who is an at-will employee in the private sector. Those at-will employees can be hired very quickly. They may be hired the same day in which they come for the interview. That's something that we are not necessarily able to do in the public sector because we also built into this process, we have a lot of background checks that are done. You know, I would have to call the references and talk to all these referees, all these people, and usually they'll have anywhere from 3 to 6 referees for each for each finalist. Have to call and contact all those individuals. So it is a very protracted process. So we know the recruitment process is much slower and much more protracted in the public as compared to the private sector. The second thing we do in the procurement function is selection. So we have to have some type of an empirical basis to use to decide which applicants are being selected to be offered these job opportunities. Traditionally, in the career civil service system, after the Civil Service Reform Act, we did still rely upon a lot of these examinations. The primary examination that was used at the federal level was referred to as the PACE exam, P-A-C-E, the PACE exam. And those PACE exams were oftentimes constructed by the Office of Personnel Management. They were then implemented by the Office of Personnel Management. Those scores on those exams, they would be scored by the Office of Personnel Management. And then what the personnel office would do is it would then create an eligibility list. So those people, those applicants who scored in either the top 3 or the top 5 scores on the examination, they would be placed upon this eligibility list. Agencies could only interview people who were on that eligibility list that was provided to them by the personnel office. It's usually referred to as either a rule of 3 or a rule of 5. Sometimes the list is eligibility list of 3, sometimes it's an eligibility list of 5. Those examinations were intended to be kind of benign, objective tests of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that someone has requisite for doing the job in an effective way. Now, those examinations, those old PACE exams, suffered from a lot of problems. One of the primary problems with examinations is their lack of validity. And you're probably familiar with the term validity. You'll talk a lot more about validity when you get to 696 research methods. But validity basically says that we are measuring what we say we are measuring. So if we're measuring what we are saying we're measuring, we have what's called validity in our examination. The problem is a lot of these examinations lack validity. And there are different types of validity involved. One of the most common types of validity in job exams is what's known as content validity. Content validity means that the content of the job matches the content of the examination. So if you're testing people on skills that are not necessary to be successful once hired into the job, then that exam lacks content validity. Very important case in the 1970s, the Griggs versus Duke Power Company case established this idea that examinations need to have this type of content validity. The problem in that case is that they were hiring people for maintenance level jobs, oftentimes custodial jobs, but the examinations had questions about high order mathematics that really didn't have any correlation whatsoever to success in this custodial job. So the exam, the content of the exam must match the content of the job itself. A lot of these exams lack that type of content validity. A lot of these examinations also lacked what's known as criterion validity. I'll put that in text chat as well. Criterion validity. And criterion validity refers to how well does performance on the exam correlate with performance on the job. You would think that if someone performs well on the exam, then they'll also perform well on the job. If they perform poorly on the exam, they would perform poorly on the job. It's criterion validity. And there are two different ways in which you can measure criterion validity. One way to measure criterion validity is through the predictive method, what's called predictive validation. In predictive validation, you would have people sit for the examination. You would then score the examination. You would take your top scorers on the exam and you will hire them into a probationary position in the organization. You would then, as a control group, select people who perform poorly on the exam and hire them into a position in the organization. So your best scorers and your worst scorers get hired into probationary positions. Now, it's important to note that to do this, these are probationary positions. So once you're in a probationary position, you do not have the same career civil service protections that someone who is in a permanent position would have. So in a lot of our federal jobs, once you get hired into the federal government, you are hired on probationary basis for usually 1 year. Sometimes it's 2, but usually it's 1 year. A lot of these job cuts we're seeing at the federal level have started with those probationary employees because it's much easier to terminate a probationary employee than it is a career civil servant who's been on the job for more than 1 year. And then once you hire your best scorers and your worst scorers, you will then compare their performance and see how they are performing on the job. If people who perform well on the exam perform well on the job, people who perform poorly on the exam perform poorly on the job, then that exam is said to have criterion validity. You have now used the exam as a predictor of future performance on the job. The other variation here, other than predictive validation, is what's known as concurrent validation. And in concurrent validation, you just reverse the process. So you take current employees and you evaluate their performance. So you find your top performers and your lowest performers. You then administer this examination to your top performers and your lowest performers. Those top performers should perform well on the exam. Those poorer performers should perform poorly on the exam. if that exam has criterion validity, if that exam actually represents the skills that are necessary to do a good job. So again, predictive and concurrent validation are just two strategies you can use to measure the criterion validity of a job examination. But what we were learning is a lot of these job examinations lack both content as well as criterion validity. We also found that some of these examinations had a lot of cultural bias that were built into them. And the way in which these exams were structured, they were penalizing certain people over other people. And it was because of that implicit cultural bias that had been built into the questions that were part of the exams. So when we did use these exams, we would then score the exams, and oftentimes there would be some bonus points that were added on. And those bonus points were added on primarily for what's known as veterans preference. And veterans preference would mean that after we score the exams, we would then add on perhaps 5 points for someone's score if they were a veteran of military service. And so usually you have that veterans preference. But because of all the problems we saw with these examinations, the federal government in a lot of states have moved away from the use of examinations and have moved more toward a more holistic review of an applicant and their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So instead of having them sit for an examination, and these examinations took a lot of time to develop. When I was in graduate school, I worked for an institute, and one of our primary contracts was to work with the local civil service commission to create the job examinations for the county. And it took a long time to create those examinations, and even putting all that time in, we still could not always be sure that those exams were valid indicators. So we moved to a much more holistic review of things like the resume, the education that someone has, the amount of experience they have, the listing of the types of skills that they have acquired, and it'll be a much more holistic, looking at their references, reading their letters of reference. That's looking at their knowledge, skills, and abilities in a much more holistic manner. That's where the federal government has moved. That's where a lot of state governments have moved as well. So we have much less emphasis placed upon examinations. Where you will see job examinations still used will be for positions that have very specialized skills. So if you have some type of a computer scientist position that requires, advanced coding type of knowledge, you may still apply an examination for that type of position. But for more generalist types of positions, it's a much more holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. A variation that some agencies can use is what's known as an assessment center. So in an assessment center, what we would do is we would take our top applicants and we would bring them into a simulated work setting. So perhaps on a Saturday morning, we would set up the simulated work setting. We would bring in our top applicants into that work setting, and then we would allow them to do the type of work that they would normally be doing if they were hired into the job. Now, there are a couple of problems with using assessment centers. One is they're very costly because you're setting up this simulated work environment. You have to have people from your organization who are there to review the work and observe how these people are doing their work. So it's very cost intensive. The second problem is the Hawthorne effect. We know from Elton Mayo and his Hawthorne studies that when you watch people, they tend to perform differently than when they are not being watched. So when you put people into these assessment centers, ostensibly they know that they're being watched and that their performance in these assessment centers will dictate whether or not they get this job offer. So they're oftentimes going to be more dedicated and work harder and result in a higher work output while they're in these assessment centers, as opposed to what they will do once they are hired into the position. So a lot of agencies don't use assessment centers for those reasons. Most of them rely upon a more holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. And certainly when we hire a new faculty member, that's what we do, a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. We will actually bring people to campus and have them do teaching demonstrations. We'll have them do a research demonstration. Whenever possible, we'll have them meet with students as well and then talk to students as a focus group about what their impressions are of the teaching skills of that individual. So they will have to perform those types of basic tasks once they are on campus for the interview. But overall, it's more of a much more holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities. Once you hire people to work in the organization, so once you get through that procurement stage, you are now in the allocation phase where you need to divide up the work among people in the organization. Max Weber told us we base organizations on division of labor and specialization of tasks. So how are we going to divide up the work? We will divide up the work based upon evaluating the work that is being done. So one of the first steps we will do in evaluating the work that people are doing on a daily basis is what's known as a job analysis. In a job analysis, we will look at each individual position within our organization, and we will deconstruct each individual position into its component elements. So what we will do is we will have a survey for that person who's in that position, ask them, what types of tasks are you doing on a daily basis, and what percentage of your day do you devote to each one of those tasks? So if it's someone who is working the front desk, that person may have the tasks of writing correspondence. Well, what percentage of your time do you spend writing correspondence? Then another task they may have may be greeting visitors. Well, what percentage of your time do you spend greeting visitors? Maybe it's referring people to the correct office. Well, what percentage of your time do you spend doing that? And so we'll break up the job into each of the tasks that are being done on a daily basis and what percentage of the day is spent on each one of those tasks. We'll not only survey the people who are in those positions, but we'll also sometimes also shadow those people in that you'll have someone from the HR office who will come on a certain day of the week and will actually be with that person as they are doing their job to confirm that the information they report that they're doing, that they are actually doing. Sometimes that shadowing will last for more than a day. Sometimes it'll be up to a week. But we're really trying to dig into those jobs and see what those jobs are all about. And that's what's known as a job analysis. And it's done individually for each different position. Once we have learned what each position does, the amount of time they spend doing those tasks on a daily basis through our job analysis, we are then ready to move into the next step, which is a job evaluation. And in a job evaluation, we're going to take the results of the job analysis and we are going to then compare position to position. So, say for instance, we have a position of a police chief and we have a position of a patrol officer. So we've done a job analysis of both those positions. So we have a good sense of what both those incumbents are doing on a daily basis. Now we are going to compare them for the purpose of classifying those positions. So for the police chief, that police chief probably has a lot of supervisory responsibilities that they are engaging in. They're responsible for the entire police department. They probably have a lot of budget responsibilities. They may prepare and approve the budget for the police department. So they have budgetary responsibilities. They have a lot of responsibilities for the human resource management function as a police chief. They probably have a lot of public-facing types of responsibilities in terms of interfacing with the media and interfacing with the public. So those are some more responsibilities in that job. For all those responsibilities in that job, we then need to look at what are the types of skills that are necessary in order to effectively carry out those types of responsibilities. So we'll look at that for the police chief, and we've got that from our job analysis. Then we'll compare it to the job analysis from a patrol officer position. So for the patrol officer, they probably do not have a lot of budgetary responsibility. They probably don't have a lot of supervisory responsibility unless they're supervising a rookie on the street. They usually don't have a whole lot of supervisory responsibility. They probably don't have a lot of responsibility in terms of talking to the media. They will have responsibility interfacing with the public, but it's more at an individual level as opposed to a macro level like a police chief. But we'll also realize that for a patrol officer, one element of the job that certainly would score higher than the police chief would be risk of physical harm. If you're a patrol officer and you're out there on the street every single day, you run a much higher risk of physical harm than probably the police chief would. So these are all the different elements that we will compare between the position of police chief and that of patrol officer. Most likely, we will use a type of job evaluation that's known as a point factor job evaluation. And that's by far the most common type of job evaluation that's historically been used in the public sector. In a point factor job evaluation, we will look at each of those different tasks and responsibilities of the job, and then we will assign a weighting mechanism to each. So how important for the police chief position is the idea of managing a budget? Is that 20% importance? Is that 30% importance? How important is that? How important is it to face a risk of physical harm? Is that 10% important? Is that 20% important? But we'll assign those weighting mechanisms to each one of those elements of both of those jobs. We will then take a numerical range from 1 to 10, and we'll then assign a number value to each one of those job responsibilities. So obviously for the responsibility of managing a budget, for the police chief, that might score a 9 out of 10 because they are responsible for the overall department's budget. For a patrol officer, they may score a 1 out of 10. So for the police chief, we take the 9 out of 10, multiply it times the weighting mechanism. For the patrol officer, 1 out of 10, multiply times the weighting system. And we do that for each one of the different elements of the job. Hence the reason why it's called a point factor is that we're assigning points to each one of those weighted factors of the job. We then add up all those weighted factors, and that then gives us an overall summary score for the police chief as well as for the patrol officer. Those summary scores we get from this job evaluation will then allow us to place these positions into our position classification system and then assign a compensation level based upon where those positions are arrayed in our position classification system. So this is what is meant to give us equity of pay. So people who have more responsibilities, more significant responsibilities in their job, they get compensated at a higher level than someone who scores lower on that point factor job evaluation. So it allows us to then compare job to job. So the big difference here is the job analysis looks at each individual job individually to look at its component elements. A job evaluation, we are comparing position to position based upon their job elements, assigning points to all those different factors, and then using that information to put the position in our position classification system. So if you get a job in the federal government in the general schedule and your position is classified as a GS-13, someone else's position is a GS-11, there's a reason why your position is a GS-13. You probably have more supervisory responsibility. The position requires higher levels of education. There is some empirical basis for your job being a GS-13 at a higher salary level than someone else's job at a GS-11 at a lower salary level. So we do job analysis, we do job evaluation, and then we put these positions into our position classification system. But a job analysis and a job evaluation is not just important for position classification, they're also important for the creation of position job descriptions. Now, probably if you're working in any type of governmental agency, even in a nonprofit organization, you probably have a position description. And that position description, at the very least, will list out, here are the tasks that you are responsible for doing, and then here's the percentage of time that you are spending on those tasks. Again, that information is going to come directly from that job analysis. If you haven't done a good job analysis for all the positions in your organization, it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to write accurate position descriptions for each one of those positions. So that idea of a position description listing, here are the tasks and here's the percentage of time spent on those tasks, that is a traditional position description. And that's what most agencies will use. However, some agencies have moved more toward what's known as an ROD. And an ROD stands for a results-oriented description. In a results-oriented description, we will also include, along with the tasks and the percentage of time spent on those tasks, performance expectations. So go back to that very simple example of someone who is working the front desk in an office building. We said that person, 3 main tasks that they engage in, probably be more than that, but one task is that they will write correspondence. Another task will be that they are answering phones. Another task will be that they are greeting visitors. So we'll just say those are three main tasks that they do on a daily basis. In a results-oriented description, we'll then have performance expectations attached to each one of those tasks. So in terms of written correspondence, performance expectation may be to complete all written correspondence by their assigned due date and with less than one error per correspondence. And so we've got a performance standard that people need to adhere to. Answering the phones, maybe a performance standard would be to answer all phone calls with the following greeting, whatever that uniform greeting is, and to make sure to answer all phone calls within 2 rings. That's a very specific performance standard that they are being held to account for. Maybe in terms of greeting visitors, it's every visitor gets greeted upon entering the building, and that's a performance expectation. The nice thing about incorporating these performance expectations into results-oriented position descriptions is obvious. People then know what the expectations are for their performance, so that later on, when they have their performance evaluation, their performance appraisal, there are no big surprises, that they're not going to be shocked if they don't get the performance evaluation that they expect to get. Performance evaluation is another key step here in the function of allocation and evaluation. So we've already evaluated the job itself. Now we're going to evaluate the performance of the incumbent in that job, and that's what performance evaluation is. The problem with performance evaluation is that employees are hesitant to participate in the process, and supervisors are also hesitant to engage in the process. Employees are hesitant to engage in the process because they fear what we refer to as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a major issue in performance evaluation. Most employees feel that they are doing a very good job. They feel they're doing a good job, but then they get the results of their performance evaluation, and there's some feedback there that they are not performing quite as well as they originally thought they were. That creates a cognitive dissonance. Whenever there's a cognitive dissonance in what you believe and what you are hearing, there is a likelihood that people will disregard what they are hearing. And so the performance evaluation is not going to be useful for them, and they're not really going to want to get that type of negative constructive feedback. Supervisors oftentimes are hesitant to engage in performance evaluation because of the importance of all the perks that are attached to performance evaluation. So based upon someone's performance evaluation, they may then be eligible for participating in some type of a leadership program, a leadership training program. Well, those are very high stakes for that individual. If you're a supervisor and you know that a negative performance evaluation will mean that this person is not then able to participate in this training they want to participate in, then you kind of have this, what's known as a fear of playing God. You have this fear that, well, it's going to be such negative repercussions for this individual, I don't want to do it to that individual employee. When you have employees who are reticent to engage in performance evaluation, and you have supervisors who are also hesitant to engage, it becomes difficult to do a routine, periodic evaluation of employee performance. The moral of the story with performance evaluation is the more that you can involve the employee in the construction of the evaluation process, the more likely they are to buy in and accept the results of that evaluation. And it kind of goes back to what we talked about with policy implementation, Pressman, Waldowski, and Martha Durthick. The more you involve your implementers, the more likely they are to support the policy. Well, here, the more you involve your employees, the more likely they are to support the results of that performance evaluation. There are different ways, different formats that we can use to conduct our performance evaluations. I'm sure in your position, you probably had multiple performance evaluations before. The most common format for performance evaluation is graphic rating. Graphic rating is where we use those categories of excellent, good, fair, poor, all those different ordinal types of rankings. That's a graphic rating type of system. The nice thing about graphic rating is that it is very easy for employers to complete. The problem with graphic rating is obviously you don't get a whole lot of formative feedback. So there are two parts of the evaluation process. There's the summative aspect, and then there is the formative aspect. Summative aspect gives you a summary score of how well you are performing. Formative aspect provides you with formative feedback that will allow you to make changes to your performance. We would like for our performance evaluation systems to have both a summative as well as a formative aspect to them. Graphic rating alone is only a summative type of evaluation. If you want to have a formative evaluation as well, you would have to combine graphic rating with perhaps an essay approach, where there is some type of narrative feedback that's being provided to the employee to tell the employee, here are some different ways in which you could improve your performance. So if you can combine graphic rating with essay, you can kind of get both summative as well as formative approaches. A forced choice approach is where we provide the supervisor with certain statements. And so we might give them 4 different statements that they can select from to represent the behavior of the employee. So you may have a prompt that says the employee is typically, and then one response could be on time for work every day. Another response could be late 1 day per week. Another response could be late 2 days per week. And those are forced choices that you'll then have the supervisor select one of those choices to then fill in that blank. Problem with forced choice is if you don't provide the right mixture of responses for your supervisor, then you're going to have a lot of measurement error, a lot of measurement bias. Some organizations will incorporate a ranking technique into their performance evaluations where they will rank their employees' performance. Sometimes that's difficult to do. It's comparing apples and oranges for different types of position descriptions. The nice thing about ranking is that it does give you an empirical basis for then assigning bonuses and performance pay if that is something your agency has the ability to do. But one of the more sophisticated ways of doing performance evaluation is with an approach that's known as BARS, B-A-R-S, BARS. BARS stands for a behaviorally anchored rating scale. Behaviorally anchored rating scales, very similar to what you see in some of your syllabi. So whenever your instructor has a grading rubric that they include in the syllabus, that grading rubric will probably say, here is the behavior that will result in a grade of A. Here is the behavior that results in a grade of B. Here is the behavior that results in a grade of C. That is a behaviorally anchored rating scale. So if you get a B, you know you got the B because your behavior exhibited this behavior that was in alignment with a B. If you want to increase your grade to an A, then you'll have to exhibit the behavior that's in alignment with the grade of A. Same type of thing in performance evaluation. So if you want to move from good to excellent in your performance evaluation, your behavior would have to change to be the behavior that is under that excellent column. So the nice thing about BARS is it combines both the summative as well as the formative together into one performance evaluation format. And we have seen a lot of organizations move toward the use of these behaviorally anchored rating scales. But regardless of the format of performance evaluation that you use, you really do need to get the buy-in on the part of your employees in order for your performance evaluation process to have any type of impact upon an employee's performance. There was a very famous article that was written several years ago by a person by the name of Charles Fox. And Fox referred to performance evaluation as being what he called the keystone of human resource management, referred to as the keystone of human resource management. So you're probably familiar with what a keystone is. You think about an arch, an arch that's constructed with all these stones. That stone at the very top of the arch that holds the entire arch together, that is what's known as the keystone. If you look at performance evaluation as the keystone of the entire human resource management arch, it kind of makes sense that if you don't have a good system of performance evaluation, then you're not going to be able to achieve your goals as an organization because you have people who may be underperforming. You're not going to know how to reward people. You're not going to know how to provide them with training and development, what type of training and development to provide them with. You're not going to be able to sanction and discipline employees who are performing at subpar evaluation levels. So it really kind of holds the entire human resource management process together. Then based upon the results of your performance evaluation, You then move into the third function, which is training and development. Based upon the results of this performance evaluation, we are then going to identify, are there aspects to someone's performance that are not quite up to the level they need to be? If you identify subpar performance, then for these career civil service employees, you then need to offer them opportunities for training and development. So offer them the opportunities to enhance their skills and enhance their talents so that they can take these skills they learn back onto the job and enhance their performance levels. Training and development in a lot of organizations is all too often used as a reward as opposed to professional development. So sometimes employees that are well liked or employees you think are great employees, they'll be sent off to a conference in Hawaii kind of as a reward, even though that conference in Hawaii should be used to help people develop their skills and help them with their training. In doing training and development, we can do training and development in-house, we can do it out of house. In-house training and development, we'll either use our own employees to conduct the training, or we might, bring in some consultants to conduct the training for us. Out of house, we will send people away to training sessions in other areas, other parts of the country, and allow them to get their training there. In-house training oftentimes is less costly than out-of-house training. Whatever type of training and development approach you use, you need to have adequate ROI. You need to have an adequate return on your investment. If your training program is very cost intensive, hopefully the benefits will exceed the costs you had to pay for that training program. A few years ago, our former dean here in the college had a training program that she purchased, a leadership training program she purchased, the 5 behaviors. And that was something I think the college spent something like $250,000 on purchasing. Employees really didn't want to participate in it, and it kind of went by the boards and kind of died off, and nothing really happened with it. And that $250,000 investment really didn't pay a whole lot in terms of dividends in creating more effective leaders and changing the culture of the organization. So you really need to focus on that return on investment to make sure that you are spending public taxpayer dollars as effectively and efficiently as possible. Training and development opportunities need to be offered whenever subpar performance is identified. These are career civil servants, which means that they are not only hired based upon their merit, but they keep their jobs based upon their performance. So if you're going to move into the sanctioning and discipline function of human resource management, there must be a documented basis for doing so. So whenever you witness subpar performance on the part of the employee, you then have to offer opportunities for training and development. Now, whether or not an employee takes you up on those offers, that's up to the employee. But you have to at least offer that training for the employee. Hopefully, the employee will then take advantage of that training. After they have engaged in that training, then maybe 3 months down the line, then they get another performance evaluation. If that evaluation is still substandard, then you might need to provide them with more training opportunities, then reevaluate their performance, and so on and so on. You cannot sanction and discipline an employee based upon one occurrence. So one poor performance evaluation is not going to be enough to sanction and discipline an employee. You need to document a pattern of consistent subpar performance. A pattern of subpar performance followed by offer of training and development opportunities, more subpar performance, more training and development opportunities. There must be a documented pattern, and that documented pattern must be in the form of written documentation in that person's personnel record. And that's because, again, they're not an at-will employee, they are a career civil servant. If the provision of all these different training opportunities still does not rectify performance, then you can move into the fourth stage of the human resource process, which is discipline and sanctioning. When you engage in discipline and sanctioning, it is again based upon the written documentation of a pattern of subpar performance. There is a common misperception out there that career civil servants cannot be terminated. That's not true. They can be terminated, but only after this documentation of subpar performance and the provision of training opportunities. So this is obviously your very last step. Discipline and sanctioning will probably result in some type of a grievance that will be filed by the employee with their union, and then that will be something that the management agency will then have to deal with that grievance. Here in California, those types of grievances can go to CalPERB. And CalPERB is the Public Employee Relation Board, CalPERB, P-E-R-B. CalPERB can then review those when people have been relieved from their duties, when people have been removed from office. They'll review that case, and then they can offer then render a decision upon whether or not that was a proper removal. When I served on a school board as president of a school board, we had a few of these instances where we would have to remove a teacher for documented poor performance. The teacher would then go to their union. The union file a grievance with their union. Then the district would have to sit down with the union and have those types of negotiations. If they could not come to an agreement, then the union could then take that case up to CalPERB, and then CalPERB would do their investigation. CalPERB investigations can be very time intensive. They can also be very cost intensive as well. So it's always good if the agency can come to some type of agreement on this termination before it works its way up to CalPERB. But you can terminate career civil servants, but it must be for cause. It must be performance-based. And it must be performance-based, again, not just because of the career civil service system, but also because of the influence of unionization. Statistics, when you look at statistics of unionization between the private and the public sector, you will see that public sector employees tend to be unionized at about 3 times the level of their private sector counterparts. So we deal a lot more with unionization and collective bargaining here in the public sector as compared to the private sector. It's about 35 to 36% of public sector employees nationwide are part of some type of a bargaining unit. It's about 11 or 12% in terms of the private sector. Unionization means that there is a collective bargaining process. This collective bargaining process is a process of negotiation that occurs between the bargaining unit that has been designated to represent the employees and the agency's management. The PPA 570 course, Negotiating Dynamics, will get into in a lot more detail this idea of the negotiations that happen in collective bargaining. You'll have the opportunity in that class to either be part of a bargaining unit or be part of agency management, and to actually deal with some of these issues in a kind of a role-playing practical type of setting. By collective bargaining, we have these negotiations, and the primary goal of collective bargaining is to obviously come up with a contract, an agreement, a collective bargaining agreement. Now, not every issue is on the table in collective bargaining. Which issues can be negotiated over, which issues cannot be negotiated over, will depend upon, number one, what state you are in, and also the position in which you are in as well. Some states have a very permissive scope of collective bargaining. Those states with permissive scopes of collective bargaining will allow collective bargaining over a much wider, much broader array of issues as compared to states that have a much more limited, restricted scope of bargaining. States that typically have had a very permissive scope of bargaining are states such as Wisconsin, California. We usually fall more on the permissive as compared to restrictive side. States that tend to have a more restrictive scope of collective bargaining, that you're looking at primarily a lot of southern states. And so Alabama's and Louisiana's and Mississippi's tend to have a much more restrictive scope of collective bargaining. Florida's scope of collective bargaining has become much more restrictive in recent years as well. At the federal level kind of has a weird system in that it typically has a relatively permissive scope with the exception of compensation. For the majority of federal employees, compensation is not included within the permissive scope of collective bargaining. So you cannot collectively bargain over compensation. The reason for that is that Congress sets the compensation of the federal service. So the GS schedule and all the levels of compensation in that GS schedule, those compensation levels are set by Congress. There is a commission on compensation that is established that will advise Congress whenever they feel that there is a need to increase the compensation of members of the federal bureaucracy. That commission will meet. That commission will then make recommendations to Congress. Some members of those commissions are appointed by the president. One of my former colleagues on COPR with NASPA, he was appointed to the commission by President Obama several years ago and served on that commission for a term, making those types of recommendations or compensation changes to Congress. But Congress makes those ultimate decisions. Since Congress decides compensation, it cannot be part of the permissive scope of collective bargaining at the federal level. In most states, compensation is certainly within the scope of collective bargaining. Here in California, most issues are within the scope of collective bargaining. When I was in grad school in Ohio, I worked on a study that looked at collective bargaining in the state of Ohio among special purpose governments. One of the issues in Ohio that's not part of the permissive scope of collective bargaining is transportation. So if you are a school district and you are in negotiations with your classified employee union, you cannot have transportation as one of those issues. So the privatization of transportation cannot be one of the issues within that scope of collective bargaining. So different states have different scopes of bargaining. Also, the position you are in will have an impact upon the types of actions you can take as part of the bargaining process. If you are in a public safety position, you will be much more limited in terms of your ability to go on strike as opposed to if you are not in a public service position. So we always hear in police force, we always hear the term of blue flu. And so since you cannot go on strike, then you would call out sick, what's called the blue flu, as a strategy in the bargaining type of process. We know the story we talked about last week with the Federal Labor Relations Authority and the air traffic controllers. President Reagan was able to fire those air traffic controllers when they were on strike because they are so closely aligned with public safety that going on strike would cause a major negative impact to public safety and could cost lives in terms of airline safety. So they were precluded from going on strike, and Reagan was then authorized to fire those individuals. So the way the collective bargaining process will work will depend upon how permissive the scope of collective bargaining is in terms of the types of issues that can be collectively bargained over. Also, collective bargaining is not just sitting down at the table trying to negotiate a new contract. There's also this process that is known here in California as meet and confer. So I think I may have mentioned this in a previous class session. If you have an agency that wants to change the work conditions for employees, and these employees are unionized, employees could then complain to the union that the agency is adding additional work duties for us that's outside of our position description. The union would then require that the agency sit down with them in a meet and confer. So the meet and confer is not really a formal grievance yet, but it's a way in which you can kind of sit down and hammer out these details about, well, should these duties be added on? Should there be additional compensation then for those duties? In my experience, meet and confers oftentimes end up resulting in MOUs. The MOU is a memorandum of understanding. And so what the agency will say is, okay, we will give them some additional compensation. This happened a lot in COVID-19. So in COVID-19, we had people who are working outside of their descriptions. And so we would have meet and confers with these union representatives. And the union would say, well, these people don't need to do these duties because they're beyond their position description. We would respond and say, well, this is an extraordinary time. This is COVID-19. And so these are things that they have to do in order to keep the district running. So we would then come to an agreement on a memorandum of understanding that we would provide them compensation for the hours that they are spending, additional compensation for the hours they are spending doing these jobs that are outside their position description. The advantage of this memorandum of understanding is that it was what we call off contract, meaning that it was temporary. So we had signed a memorandum of understanding for maybe 2 years. And then after those 2 years, that memorandum of understanding would then go out of existence. And then at that time, we could reconsider whether or not these duties were still necessary, knowing that and hoping that COVID-19 would be a temporary type of pandemic and that these functions would no longer be needed after COVID-19 had passed. Once you put something into a contract, into a collective bargaining agreement, you have now frozen it into that contract until the next time you sit down to renegotiate that contract, which may be 2 years down the road, maybe 4 years down the road. It depends on how long that contract lasts. So it's much more frozen when it's in a contract as compared to being in a temporary memorandum of understanding. Now, the problem that oftentimes arises is that the union and the bargaining unit and management, agency management cannot come to an agreement about the language that should go into that collective bargaining agreement. Whenever they come to that disagreement, that's what's known as an impasse. So whenever we arrive at an impasse in the collective bargaining process, we need to have some strategies to try and break that impasse. And there are three primary impasse resolution processes that are oftentimes used in public collective bargaining. One of those impasse resolution processes is what's known as fact finding. So in fact finding, what you'll do is you'll have the bargaining unit and agency management that will agree upon bringing in an external fact finder. That fact finder is just that. Someone to look into the facts of what's going on in this collective bargaining process, and then to produce a fact finder's report. The fact finder report is non-binding on either party, so you're not bound by it. But in this fact finder report, what the fact finder will say is, based upon what I've looked at in terms of this collective bargaining process, here is the current state of collective bargaining. Now, that fact finder's report may trend toward favoring one side over another. So what we'll do is that fact finder report will then be embargoed, which means it will then be held private for 2 weeks. So for the first 2 weeks, only the bargaining unit and only agency management will have access to that fact finder report. The idea of embargoing it for 2 weeks is that will then place pressure on these two sides to come to an agreement before the fact finder report becomes public. So if you're agency management and you read that fact finder report and it's really kind of skewed toward the union and it's making you look really bad, then you're probably going to want to come to an agreement before that fact finder report becomes public. Because once it becomes public after 2 weeks, it's then out there for everyone in the public to take a look at. So it's kind of a way to, lack of a better term, light a fire under one of the two parties to then try and get an agreement within that 2 week period of time. Another approach that can be used is mediation. The federal government has this organization called the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, otherwise known as the FMCS, the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. That service has contracts with trained mediators, and they will then send these trained mediators out to intervene in the collective bargaining process to try and come up with a negotiated agreement between the two parties. When I was in my undergraduate college, I was doing political science. One of my political science professors was a mediator, federal mediator, worked with the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service. And we very rarely had class. You know, this was before remote education because I'm very old. But we very, very rarely met in class because he was always jetting all over the country to try and do this mediation between these different collective bargaining processes. But that's the way in which the federal government can give you a little bit of help in terms of trying to come to an agreement. Mediation is, again, non-binding, is just a way to try and facilitate the agreement process. A third impasse resolution process is what's known as arbitration. And there's a type of arbitration known as final offer binding arbitration. In final offer binding arbitration, you'll have an arbiter who will come in. That arbiter will look at the last offer, the final offer of the union, the final offer of management, and will then select one of those two final offers. In final offer binding arbitration, whichever offer is selected then becomes binding. That then becomes the collective bargaining agreement. It's a very high stakes way to try and resolve an impasse, but it will assure you that you will end up getting an agreement because the arbiter will select one of the two proposals and make that proposal then binding on both of the parties. Now, the hope is that you never get to that point. The hope is that the bargaining process will be collegial, very productive type of process. A lot of organizations are engaged in what's called interest-based bargaining. In interest-based bargaining, you have an agreement on both parties that they share the same interests in coming to an agreement. And so you're not basically bargaining based upon just what you want, but what's in the best interest of the overall organization. There's a prohibition in the collective bargaining process against what is known as regressive bargaining. Regressive bargaining occurs whenever one of the parties backtracks on one of their proposals. So say, for instance, the agency says, we are going to offer the union a 2% salary increase. The union comes back and says, we want a 5% salary increase. So management then goes, no, we're going to give you a 1% increase. Going from 2% back down to 1% is regressive. That's considered to be regressive bargaining. If regressive bargaining occurs, that could be an example of what's known as an unfair labor practice, or a ULP. So if one of the two parties feels that the other party is engaging in unfair labor practices, they can then file a ULP complaint with CalPERB. CalPERB will then come in, they will review that unfair labor practice claim and decide whether or not that does constitute an unfair labor practice. If it does constitute an unfair labor practice, there can be fines and penalties that are assigned. It could also make it more difficult for the party that engaged in the unfair labor practice to have much flexibility at all in terms of the collective bargaining process. So basically, CalPERB is the umpire, is the state organization that calls balls and strikes in terms of the collective bargaining process here in the state of California. At the federal level, the umpire that calls the balls and strikes is supposed to be the Federal Labor Relations Authority. As we mentioned last week, the problem with the Federal Labor Relations Authority is that we have a lot of vacancies in terms of commissioners on the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So much so that now the Federal Labor Relations Authority has a massive backlog of cases that it still has not been able to get to. So when you have a lot of vacancies on a commission, chances are that commission is not going to be able to do its work. That's the problem with the FLRA. Let's kind of a really quick overview of unionization and the impact that unions have on the human resource management process through the construction of this collective bargaining agreement. So whenever we as public administrators are managing human resources in our organization, we not only have to pay very close attention to the regulations and the protections in the career civil service, we also have to pay very close attention to all the provisions that are spelled out in a collective bargaining agreement. If you've ever looked at your collective bargaining agreement, you know they can be very lengthy and very detailed documents. I may be wrong, but I believe that the collective bargaining agreement between the California Faculty Association and the Cal State system, I believe it consists of 41 different articles, each article looking at a different topic. So it's a very, very lengthy, very detailed type of document. That's true for most collective bargaining agreements. These collective bargaining agreements then are also temporary, and so they'll only be in place for a period of time, 2, 4 years, whatever the case may be. Then they need to be renegotiated. And the items that are renegotiated will depend upon the items that the union wants to renegotiate and the items that management wants to renegotiate as well. And you then restart this collective bargaining process. A lot of organizations have found it very helpful to do what they call labor management initiatives. And a labor management initiative, an example of that could be a labor management partnership, whereby you do a lot of team building exercises with your bargaining unit representatives as well as your negotiators from the agency. So you kind of build trust and rapport between the union as well as the agency so that when those members sit down at the table, they trust each other and they don't think that agency is hiding money. They don't think that the agency doesn't think the union is trying to exploit the resources of the agency. They kind of trust each other, and that trust can then really pave the way to a collective bargaining agreement. And a lot of organizations have had a lot of success with these types of labor management initiatives. So that in a nutshell is management of human resources. Again, to kind of just whet your appetite for what you're going to get moving forward in PPA 577 human resource management. The management of human resources is indeed one of the primary functions that we do in the field of public administration. We have a couple of peer-reviewed journals that are dedicated directly to this idea of managing human resources. Traditional PPM, public personnel management, over the years has been one of those primary peer-reviewed journals that publishes a lot of great research in the area of the management of human resources. So all that being said, do you have any questions or are there any clarifications on any of this information that we have covered in terms of managing human resources? This will give you a lot of the information that you need, especially for scenario number 1 and scenario number 2 on the final assessment. So this gives you the information that you need then to do those questions related to those scenarios. If there are no questions or any clarifications needed, I see it is 7:15, so I know it's a little bit early for a break. This is a really good breaking point before you move into management of fiscal resources. So let's take a break now, take a break until 7:30, because I'm becoming more confident we're going to have enough time to cover all of our material tonight. So take a break until 7:30. When you come back at 7:30, we'll talk about the management of fiscal resources, and I'll give you a foreshadowing of some of the information that you'll get with Dr. Zhao in your PPA 555 Public Budgeting and Finance course. So take a break. I'll see you back here at 7:30. Welcome back, everyone. It's 7:30, so let's move into the home stretch. And this is the last piece of information that we cover in this course, and that's the management of financial or fiscal resources. And obviously, this is another primary function of public administrators. We are managing public taxpayer money, so it's important that we have a good sense of how that money is managed and how that money should be managed. So whenever you talk about the management of financial resources or fiscal resources in the public sector, it really requires a good understanding of a public budget. And so when you take your 525 public budgeting course, you'll talk a lot about what budgets are and what they are not. But a budget we oftentimes think of as being a statement of, here is the amount of money that we are going to spend next year, and this is what we are spending that money on. So it's a statement of how much we're spending and what we're spending that money on. And I think that's very true. It's a very basic definition of a budget. When you dig a little bit deeper into public budgets, you see that they really are about a lot more than just that. When we construct our budgets, we are constructing our budgets based on the assumption that we have finite fiscal resources, we have a finite amount of money, and we then have to try and meet infinite demands from the public with those finite resources. Whenever finite resources come into conflict with infinite demands, it means that there are going to be trade-offs that we have to make. There are opportunity costs to funding one program over another program. So if you fund one program, by definition, means you're not going to be able to fund another program. If you're spending more money on one program, it probably means by definition, you're going to have to spend less money on another program. Whenever you have those types of trade-offs and those opportunity costs, budgets really take on a much more substantial meaning. Instead of just being a statement of dollars and cents, budgets really are statements of societal priorities. They really tell us where the priorities of a society are at. So if we are spending more money on education and less money on defense, then our priority is obviously going to be in the area of education. When you start to view public budgets as statements of priorities, it again really elevates their significance in terms of a function of public administration. There are also different types of budgets that are used. There are operating budgets and there are capital budgets. Operating budgets are used primarily for the day-to-day functions of government organizations. So your salaries, your benefits, your supplies, your maintenance, all those utilities, all those day-to-day functions, those will be funded through your operating budget. Then state and local governments maintain a separate capital budget. That capital budget will be for their capital improvement projects. And we've talked in previous class sessions about capital projects. A capital project is like a city hall, a recreation center, an aquatic center. Those are very high price tag, very long lifespan, non-recurring types of expenditures. You build a city hall, you're not going to build a city hall every single year. So it's a non-recurring expenditure, but it also costs a lot of money and it's going to last for a long period of time. Those types of capital projects at the state and local level tend to be segregated into separate capital budgets for the purpose of spending more time and putting more effort and thought into which of those projects we should be funding. So those are what Etzioni refer to as the big items that you want to be more rational for. The more mundane items, such as the amount of supplies you're purchasing from one year to the next, those are smaller issues, and so those you can be more incremental with in your operating budget. So operating budgets tend to be constructed in an incremental type of manner, small incremental changes from one year to the next. Capital budgets tend to be done in a much more rational manner through what we call capital improvement plans. So we'll put together a capital improvement plan that will be maybe a 5-year plan where we will plan out all these different capital projects, what will be funded, and in what year those capital projects will be funded. So two different types of decision making that are used, whether it's an operating budget or whether it's a capital budget. As I mentioned, state and local governments tend to maintain both operating as well as capital budgets. The national government usually does not. The national government usually does not maintain a separate capital budget because the cost of one singular capital project is not enough to distort the federal budget. The federal budget is so massive in scope and size that a $100 million capital project is going to be a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of the federal budget. If you're a local city and you have a $100 million capital project, if you put that into your operating budget, it's going to blow a massive hole in that operating budget and will make it impossible for you to balance your revenues and your expenditures. And most state constitutions require that state and local governments balance their budgets. That is not a requirement at the national level. The national level can certainly run a deficit and can certainly borrow money. So let's talk a bit about the process of how public budgets are constructed. And for this discussion tonight, and you'll probably do this, a similar thing in 555, we're going to talk primarily about the federal budget process, because the federal budget process really kind of serves as a guidepost for how state governments then do their budgeting as well. There are differences between the California state process and the federal process, and I'll highlight those differences for you tonight. We're going to start with the federal process because that really is kind of the template that a lot of states more or less adhere to in putting their budgets together. So the process of putting together a public budget is usually going to go through 4 different phases: preparation, formulation, execution, and evaluation. So let's start with the preparation phase of public budgeting at the federal level. The preparation phase is where we decide how much money we have to spend in the next fiscal year. So at the federal level, to determine how much money we're going to have to spend, we have 2 primary organizations that are primarily responsible for budget preparation. The one agency is at the executive end of the equation, and that's what we know as the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget has been around for 100 years, hasn't always been called the Office of Management and Budget, but the Office of Management and Budget is the central clearinghouse for the president in putting together the federal budget. On the legislative side, we have an organization called the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office was created in the 1970s to kind of serve as a counterweight, a counterbalance to the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget provides all this information, all these resources for the president. Congress wanted its own source of resources and information, so it created the Congressional Budget Office. In the preparation phase, we need to know how much money we have available to spend, and then how much money we're going to have to spend in order to continue maintaining the current services that we funded last year. So we have to know how much money we will have and then how much money we are going to have to spend. Those two studies are done by the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office. When you get into 5C5, you'll talk more specifically about the differences in the way in which OMB and CBO do their work. But essentially what they're doing is doing revenue forecasts for how much revenue we can anticipate getting, and they'll also do expenditure estimates, estimating how much money we will have to spend next fiscal year in order to do the same types of things we did in the past fiscal year. OMB and CBO's results are often different from each other. And the reason for that is they use different types of methodologies and also the masters that they serve. OMB serves the president. And so OMB is there to try and bolster the policy goals of the president. The president will appoint the director of the Office of Management and Budget. We saw that just the director of the Office of Management and Budget was just confirmed by the Senate a few days ago and took office, and Russ Boyd. And so that is your director of the Office of Management and Budget. As a presidential appointment, the director of the Office of Management and Budget will try and promote the policy interests of the president, one singular individual. The Congressional Budget Office, however, serves Congress. So it serves 435 members of the House of Representatives and 100 members of the Senate. So it's serving 535 people as opposed to one singular individual. So usually, Office of Management and Budget, their revenue forecasts are much more optimistic than what we tend to see out of the Congressional Budget Office. The corollary here in the state of California is the Department of Finance on the executive side, which is the corollary to the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level, and then the Legislative Analyst Office on the legislative side, which is the corollary to the Congressional Budget Office at the federal level. So once the OMB and CBO put together all their forecasts and all their estimates and projections, the OMB is then responsible for putting out a call for budget proposals. And that call for proposals will go to all the agencies and all the departments across the entire federal bureaucracy. Those agencies and those departments will then put together their budget requests for the next fiscal year and transmit those requests to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget will receive those requests, will usually make revisions and cuts to those requests, and those revised requests will then become part of the executive budget, the president's budget. Once the president's budget has been created and transmitted to Congress, we then move from the preparation phase to the second phase, which is formulation. That usually occurs sometime around the beginning of February. So usually a president will give a State of the Union address in late January, laying out all of their priorities for the country. Then the budget based upon those priorities will then be released in early February and will then be going to Congress for Congress's consideration. So at the federal level, we usually move from preparation to formulation in early February. Here in the state of California, the governor will put together what's called their budget bill. And that budget bill is usually constructed in January and provided to the state legislature in January, at which point we move from preparation into formulation. So formulation is when the legislative body starts considering the budget. So the federal level begins in early February. When the president's budget goes to Congress, the first place the president's budget goes will be to the budget committees in the House and the Senate. And there was a major piece of budget reform in 1970s, the Congressional Budget Act. And the Congressional Budget Act created a budget committee in the House and a budget committee in the Senate. The job of those budget committees is to pass this thing known as a concurrent resolution on the budget. Well, a concurrent resolution on the budget. The concurrent resolution on the budget is supposed to be passed by April the 15th. Now, this is a resolution. So as a resolution, it does not need the signature of the president. It is just a statement of intent by the House and the Senate Budget Committee establishing the maximum amount of money that can be spent across all the programmatic areas of the budget. So it will say, here's the maximum amount of money that can be spent in the area of agriculture. Here's the maximum amount that can be spent in education. Here's the amount that can be spent in energy. Here's the amount that can be spent on defense. And we'll set maximum ceilings on the amount of money to be spent. The purpose of that concurrent resolution on the budget is to kind of give us a framework for how much money can be spent across all those different programmatic areas. From that point, the budget then goes to the Appropriations Committee in the House and the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. So there's one Appropriation Committee in the House, one Appropriation Committee in the Senate. Each of those appropriations committees will have their own subcommittees. They'll have 12 different subcommittees as part of those appropriation committees. So each appropriation committee will have 12 different subcommittees. A subcommittee on each of the different programmatic areas. So there'll be an education appropriations subcommittee, a defense appropriations subcommittee, and so on and so on. Each of those appropriation subcommittees will work on an appropriation bill within their area of spending, will hold hearings and make changes to that appropriation bill, will then pass that appropriation bill back up to the parent appropriation committee. The parent appropriation committee will then have their own hearings, do their own markup and amendments for each one of those 12 appropriation bills, will then pass those appropriation bills then out to the floor of the House, and then a similar type of process works over in the Senate. Now, that is for a type of spending that is known as discretionary spending. We're going to get kind of into the weeds a little bit here. There are two main types of spending in the federal budget process. There is discretionary spending, and then there's a second type of spending known as mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress can directly increase or decrease spending on a public program, that is considered to be discretionary. That goes through this process known as appropriation. So all the spending that's coming out of these 12 appropriation bills, this is all considered to be discretionary spending, spending that Congress has direct control over changing. Then there's a second category of spending known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending goes through an authorizations process. This is spending that Congress does not have direct control over changing. So, spending on things such as interest on the national debts. Once Congress borrows money, it then enters into this legal obligation to repay the debt through principal and interest payments. Those interest payments, that's mandatory debt. They are required to make those types of payments. Another type of mandatory spending is spending on entitlement programs. An entitlement program is a program in which if you meet the legal eligibility requirements, you are legally entitled to those benefits. So a lot of our social welfare programs are considered to be entitlement programs. People meet the legal eligibility requirements, they are then legally entitled to get those benefits. More people are eligible for those benefits, means spending is going to go up, irrespective of anything Congress could have done in the appropriations process. Social Security, which is a hot button topic always, and especially today in these cuts to the federal government. A lot of people don't realize that Social Security is also an entitlement program. You are entitled to those benefits when you are vested in Social Security. So Social Security spending is mandatory spending. All that mandatory spending goes through an authorization process separate from the appropriations process. So we have separate authorization committees that will pass those authorizing bills to then keep those programs authorized and keep those programs going. And then all the discretionary spending will go through the appropriations committee and the appropriations subcommittees through the appropriations process. So how the money goes through the budgeting process depends upon whether it's discretionary money or mandatory money. But we're going to focus primarily on the discretionary side in the appropriations process because that's usually what ends up being very contentious. So each of these subcommittees will pass out their own appropriation bill to their parent appropriation committee, and then the parent appropriation committee will then pass out these 12 appropriation bills to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate, where they will then usually go to the floor under what's known as privileged status. When you go to the bill goes to the floor under privileged status, it means that there is limited debate on that bill, and there are limited possible amendments that can be added to that bill as well. So it's supposed to be a streamlined process of considering these appropriation bills on the floor of the House and on the floor of the Senate. Now, obviously, if an appropriation bill is passed by the House in different version than is passed by the Senate, we have to hammer out those differences with a conference committee. So now we have a new set of committees called conference committees that have to hammer out and reconcile those differences between the House and the Senate versions of the bill. We also reconcile those differences through this process that's known as reconciliation. And this reconciliation process is something that Congress created a couple of decades ago, well, several decades ago, actually created back in the 1970s, to be used very sparingly to try and reconcile differences between appropriation bills. How Congress uses reconciliation today is they use it today as a way to hammer these bills through Congress with very little, if no debate, and to eliminate the possibility of a filibuster over in the Senate. Now, you know how the Senate works. In order for a bill to pass the Senate, you have to break a filibuster. So if one party wants to filibuster a bill, they can get up there and talk all day long and all night long if they want to stop the consideration of a bill. In order to stop a filibuster, you have to get in the Senate what's called a vote of cloture, which is an agreement of 60 members of the Senate to stop the filibuster and pass a piece of legislation. Well, if a budget bill is going, appropriation bill is going through under reconciliation, then the rules mean that you cannot engage in a filibuster. So there's no need to try and get 60 votes to stop the debate. It can just be hammered through with a simple majority. So it's made it much easier for these appropriation bills to get through the House and the Senate, but it is still not an easy process. Congress is not supposed to use reconciliation for all appropriation bills. That's not the way the process is supposed to work. Reconciliation is supposed to be used in a very sparing type of sense. So when reconciliation is not being used, when it's not possible to engage in reconciliation, we oftentimes have a problem where the House and the Senate are unable to come to agreement on all 12 appropriation bills by the beginning of the new fiscal year. The fiscal year at the federal level runs from October 1st until September 30th. So this formulation phase, where Congress is working on the budget, will run from the beginning of February until September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, because those appropriation bills need to be passed and signed by the president by October 1st, the beginning of the next fiscal year. Because once that new fiscal year begins on October 1st, we shift from formulation into execution. And budget execution is when we are actually going out there and spending the money during that new fiscal year. Problem is, we usually don't have all 12 appropriation bills passed by the beginning of the new fiscal year. If, say, for instance, the Department of Treasury appropriation bill has not yet been passed as of October 1st, the Department of Treasury no longer has the legal ability to spend money. Their legal authority to spend money expired at the end of the last fiscal year on September 30th. So you've got a couple of choices. One choice is to pass what's called a continuing resolution. So Congress will pass a continuing resolution to say, we will fund the Department of Treasury at 80% of what it got funded last year, and we'll do that for the next 4 weeks to give ourselves a little bit more time to come to agreement on this appropriation bill. So for all those areas of spending where the appropriation bill has not been passed and been signed by the president, you'll get these continuing resolutions. These are temporary stopgap measures to keep the federal government operating. The other alternative is a partial government shutdown, where you'll say, for all those areas where the appropriation bills have not yet been signed into law, we are going to shut down those parts of the federal government. So the Department of Treasury, we are going to shut you down. We're going to say Treasury employees, including IRS officials, stay home. You are furloughed. Do not come into work because we don't have the legal authority to pay you. That type of partial government shutdown is politically painful, usually for the White House as well as for Congress. It really is very much of a political standoff that really ends up hurting average American citizens. So what Congress will do is it will try very, very hard to keep passing continuing resolutions in order to avoid a partial government shutdown. When Congress gets to the point, usually in November or December, it's been a little bit later this year, but usually November or December, it gets to the point where it will no longer tolerate continuing resolutions, and it doesn't want a partial government shutdown. So it will take all those appropriation bills that have not yet been passed yet, and it will cobble them all together into a mammoth piece of legislation known as an OBRA. And an OBRA stands for an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Let's put that in text yet. Reconciliation Act. I'm trying to type and talk at the same time, so I know I've misspelled it. But Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. It's an OBRA. All those unpassed appropriation bills get all cobbled together into that OBRA and then pass all at one point in time through an expedited reconciliation process. That is something that Congress does frequently. And by frequently, I mean almost every single fiscal year. We get an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. Is that any way to make a budget? No. That's not the way in which the process is supposed to work, but it's kind of an approach that Congress has come up with because it's having a lot of difficulty coming to agreement on these appropriation bills. It's become even much more difficult today because of those very close partisan splits in both the House as well as the Senate. When you have Republicans trying to push an appropriation bill through the House and they can only afford to lose one or two Republican votes, it becomes extremely difficult. And so it's easier to do it through an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. But again, that's not the way the process is supposed to work. But just to simplify things for us tonight, let's assume that the appropriation bills get passed by September 30th. New fiscal year begins on October 1st. Throughout from October 1st to the following September 30th, we are in the current fiscal year and we are spending the money. That is the execution phase of the budgeting process. Then once the fiscal year has ended, then you move into the fourth phase, which is evaluation. And this is where we go back and we audit the books. We look at how we spent the money. Did we spend the money in the legally appropriated manner in which we were supposed to spend the money? And then we'll ask the question, how well did we spend the money? Did spending that money help us achieve our goals and our objectives? So that, in a very large nutshell, is the federal budgeting process, the way it's supposed to work, and then the way that it actually does work in the real world. Now, here in California, it's a little bit different. So here in California, we don't have all these separate appropriation bills. We have one budget bill. That budget bill goes to the state legislature in January. Then the next red letter date we have in our budgeting process occurs in May, and that's what's known as the May revise. So between January and May, a lot of things have probably changed that will change our ability to fund all these priorities that the governor established back in January. Maybe we're having difficulty generating revenue. And because of that lack of revenue, we see that we don't have enough revenue to fund all these priorities. We will have to make revisions to the budget bill under this May revise. This year, both at the federal as well as at the state level here in California, there is income tax relief that is being provided. So the state of California is giving you until October 15th. If you live in a county that's been affected by wildfires, that includes Los Angeles County, you now have until October 15th to file and pay your taxes. Same type of thing is being done at the federal level by the IRS. That means that this revenue that normally would flow in April may not be flowing in until over the summer or as late as October. So that's going to adjust these revenue flows. All those adjustments are taken into account in the May revise. The governor then revises the budget in May. That new revised budget then is considered by the state legislature throughout the rest of May and through the beginning of June. Here in California, the state legislature is supposed to pass the state budget no later than June 15th. That state budget is supposed to be signed by the governor no later than June 30th for the beginning of the new state fiscal year on July 1st. So our fiscal year here in California runs from July 1st until June 30th, as opposed to the federal year, which runs from October 1st until September 30th. Also, another difference here in the way we do budgeting in California is here in California, we use a lot of these things known as trailer bills. So when this budget bill is passed on June 15th and then signed by the governor, there are still a lot of questions that need to be answered in terms of how this money will be spent and the specifics of how to implement the budget. A lot of those specifics then get spelled out in what are called trailer bills. And they're called trailer bills because they trail after the approval of the budget. So as a local government, just because the budget is in place as of July 1st, you may not have the direction that you need to know how to spend that state money until a relevant trailer bill is passed. I know in our school district, oftentimes what we would do is we would postpone some of our spending and would not start spending on July 1st. We would wait until we got the trailer bill to actually give us all the guidelines in terms of who is eligible and when that money can be spent and what that money can be spent on. And once we got all those details in the trailer bill, that's when we would actually go out there and start implementing and executing the budget. So that's a little bit different as compared to how the process works at the federal level. But those are the four phases in the budget process. We have a much easier time getting budgets done here in California as compared to the national government for a couple of reasons. One reason is because we do have a supermajority of one party in both the assembly as well as the state senate, and then a governor from that same party. So they oftentimes share the same priorities, which makes it a lot easier to get a budget passed. Also, we have lowered the requirement to pass a budget in the state legislature down to a simple majority. Once we made it a simple majority, it made it a lot easier to pass a budget here in California. Now, even though you only need a simple majority to pass the budget, if you want to increase taxes, that still requires a 2/3 majority. So it's a simple majority to pass the budget, 2/3 majority to raise taxes. But that simple majority and that supermajority rule by the Democratic Party has made it very easy for us to get budgets done on time here in California. So that's kind of from a 30,000-foot level, the way in which the budget process works at the federal level as well as here in the state of California. You'll learn more about that in your budgeting class and put a lot more, as we call, flesh on the bones with details in 555. Now, what do budgets look like? There are different ways in which we can construct our budgets. There are four primary budget formats that tend to be used here in the US: line item, performance-based, program-based, and zero-based budgeting. I have links to examples of each of these four budget types up on our Canvas site. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through them here tonight. You will go through them at length in your 555 course. What I want to do tonight is just kind of highlight what these formats are, how they work, and their advantages and their disadvantages. So a traditional type of budget format is what's called a line item budget. This is something that we are all familiar with because this is what most local governments use. A line item budget is also known as an object of expenditure budget. In a line item budget, we will have the line item of what the money is being spent on, and then the amount of money that's being spent on that line item. Then the next line item will be the next object or expenditure, and then the amount of money that's being spent. The advantage of a line item budget is they're very simple and they're very easy to construct. The problem with the line item budget is they don't give us much information. All they tell us is this is what we're spending the money on, and this is how much money we are spending. So essentially what a line item budget does, it emphasizes the budget as a tool of control. It allows us to control how much we're spending and what we are spending that money on. However, if we want information to tell us how to better or more efficiently spend that money, you're not going to get that from a simple line item budget. It's just not going to exist in a simple line item budget. Simple line item budgets really do lend themselves to incrementalism, small marginal changes from one year to the next. The only information we have is how much we spent and what we spent it on last year, and we'll use that information to make the budget for next year. So it's a very limited, very simple way of putting together a budget. A more sophisticated way of putting together a budget is what's called a performance-based budget. In a performance-based budget, we will combine the line item approach with performance indicators. So we will have performance indicators that will tell us not just how we're spending the money, but how well we are spending the money. So a really simple example of that could be for a police department. So a police department wants to have some performance indicators for how well they're doing their job. So the line item budget will say, we are spending X amount of money on police patrols. Well, how do we know if those police patrols are working? Well, we'll have performance indicators such as the level of burglaries compared to last year. If the level of burglaries have gone down over the past year, then that's an indicator of effectiveness. We're spending the money effectively, we're spending the money well. So we'll build in those types of performance indicators into our budgets. Now, performance-based budgeting is something that we have seen some local governments move toward. So they've added these performance indicators onto their traditional line item budget. But it's going to take a lot more thought and a lot more consideration to come up with what are the indicators of effective and efficient performance to then build those indicators into our budget. Then the third type of budget format is called a program-based budget. Now, a program-based budget is a lot different than line item of performance because it's organized completely different. So with a line item or performance-based budget, the budget is usually organized according to unit or department. So here is the budget for the police department. Here is the budget for the fire department. They're two separate departments. They have two separate budgets. And that's what you see in a line item and a performance approach. In program-based budgeting, instead of budgeting according to the department, we budget according to the program. So we ask ourselves, what is the overarching program goal of the police department and the fire department? Their overarching programmatic goal is probably the protection of persons and property. They both contribute to that program goal. So we put our budget together according to the program of protection of persons and property. And then all the activities that go on in the police department that contribute to that program goal all get budgeted there. All the fire department activities that contribute to that program goal get budgeted there as well. So we kind of commingle the police spending and the fire spending together because they are both furthering the goal of the program of protection of persons and property. So it's a completely different way of conceptualizing a budget where we organize according to the programmatic goals as according to organizing according to the individual departments or units or divisions. So when you look at a local budget, like you will probably be doing in your 555 class, you're looking for that in your budget. So is your budget organized around departments or is it organized around programs? If it's organized around programs, it's probably more of a program-based budget. If it's organized around departments, it's probably more of a line item or maybe a performance-based budget if it has performance indicators listed in that budget document. Then the fourth type of common budget format that we see used is a zero-based budget. And a zero-based budget is kind of bottom-up budgeting. So we go to the very bottom of re-justifying why we are spending money on these programs. In a line item performance or program approach, we kind of take those programs that we have been funding kind of as assumed. We've been spending money on them, so we're going to continue spending money on them. Zero-based budgeting makes you go back and re-justify why you are spending money in a programmatic area. What zero-based budgeting will do is it will go to the lowest level of an organization where budget decisions can be made. And then the budget is being made at those lowest levels. They will put together what are called decision packages, which will list out, here are the different ways we can spend the money and the consequences of spending the money in these different ways. They will rank and prioritize those decision packages and then send them up through the organizational chart. The middle level managers will re-rank and reprioritize, then send those decision packages up to the upper level of the organization. Then the highest level decision packages will then become part of that organization's budget. So it's a very bottom-up, very rational approach to putting a budget together. The obvious disadvantage of zero-based budgeting is it's very time and resource intensive. It's going to take you a lot of time and cost you a lot of money to put together a zero-based budget. To kind of give you a little bit more of a frame of reference for understanding these 4 different budget types, look at these budget types in terms of what they are trying to achieve. Line item budgeting is meant to try and use the budget document for control, to control how much money we're spending and what we are spending that money on. A performance-based budget, because it incorporates performance indicators, is oriented around the purpose of management, using the budget document for the purpose of better managing the operations of our organization. If we see that spending money on police patrols is not accomplishing a reduction in the number of burglaries, we might want to think about maybe spending less money on police patrols and spending that money elsewhere where it may be more efficient and more effective. Program-based and zero-based budgeting, those are really organized around the idea of using the budget document for the purpose of strategic planning. So how can we use the budget in order to better plan the operations of our organization? In a program-based budget, we can use it as a planning tool because it allows us to see how these activities in the police department and these activities in the fire department, how they work together in order to achieve the overall goal of protection of persons and property. So it's very much using the budget to plan the operations of your organization. But when you consider which budget format is most appropriate for a given situation, think about what are the problems that that city or that government's trying to address with their budget format. Are they trying to control their spending? Are they trying to better manage how well they're spending their money? And then also consider the amount of resources that that government has, because line item budget will be the least resource intensive. Performance-based budgeting will cost you more time and resources, but by far it's program and zero-based budgeting that will cost you the most time and resources to try and implement. So none of these 4 formats is the quote-unquote best format. It really depends upon the situation in which they're being applied. You have to really take the context of the situation into account. But when you get to budgeting, you will talk a lot more about those 4 different budget formats. You will look at examples of them. You'll have a chance to construct budgets in at least 1 or 2 of those different formats. And so I'll put a lot more detail to this discussion of budget formats once you get to 555. But up to this point in our discussion, we've been talking primarily about spending money. We've been talking primarily about expenditures. In order to spend money, we have to have money. We have to generate revenue. So let's turn our attention briefly to revenue generation on the part of governments. There are 3 primary sources of tax-based revenue we tend to rely upon in this country: property, income, and sales taxes. Now, property, income, and sales taxes will differ depending upon which type of government you're talking about, which state you are talking about, and what you're trying to achieve with raising that revenue. So let's start with property taxes. Property taxes are by far the most hated form of taxation in this country. Taxpayers typically really do not like the property tax, and they don't like the property tax for a variety of reasons. One reason is they see the property tax as being very unfair. It is seen as being unfair because the property tax is a very visible type of tax. So if you are a homeowner, and unless you have your property taxes rolled into escrow and you pay them as part of your mortgage payment, doing what we call impounding. If you don't do that, then you're going to get a very large property tax bill twice per year. It's a very visible type of tax. It really kind of slaps you in the face because it's a large tax bill. And the more visible a tax, the more people hate the tax. So the property tax is the most disliked type of taxation we have here in the US. The property tax is also what we consider to be a wealth-based tax. So we decide how much you owe in property taxes based upon the value of your home, the assessed value of your house. So the higher the assessed value of your house, the more you'll have to pay in property taxes. Now, here in California, we do have Proposition 13. And Proposition 13 was passed to limit the tax liability of homeowners so that there is a tax rate limit of 1% and there is an assessment limit of 2%, meaning that the assessed value of your property for tax purposes can only increase by a maximum of 2% per year. So we have tried to place some limitations on how onerous the property tax is on homeowners here in California. But the property tax is still something that is based upon the assessed value of your home, which makes it a wealth-based, or what we would consider to be an ability to pay tax. So people who have a higher value home are seen as having a higher ability to pay the tax. So you pay the tax based upon your ability to pay, which is indexed to the assessed value of your home. As we know, property taxes are very popular among local governments. For many years before Proposition 13, property taxes were the primary source of revenue for local governments. Post Proposition 13, we have seen local governments move away from the property tax because they are limited in the amount of money they can generate from property taxes. And we have seen local cities move more toward non-tax sources of revenue. The second type of tax is the income tax. An income tax is, again, an ability to pay tax because we index your ability to pay the income tax to your adjusted gross income. So whenever you file your taxes, which we are currently in tax filing season, you will report your adjusted gross income, and then you will pay taxes based upon that adjusted gross income. So it's very much an ability to pay type of tax. The income tax, though, is more favored than the property tax by taxpayers because it's seen as being a fairer type of taxation. And the reason for that is that we have a graduated income tax system, not just at the federal level, but also here at the state level as well. So it's a marginal tax bracket system whereby you will pay taxes based upon which tax bracket you fall in, and you only pay that higher tax rate for every dollar above an income threshold. So for every dollar above a certain threshold, it'll move you perhaps from the 10% to the 15% tax rate. And then every dollar above another threshold will move you from the 15 to 22% tax rate, but you don't pay your entire adjusted gross income at one tax rate. So you only pay every additional dollar, every increment at that higher tax rate. So it is meant to try and be a circuit breaker to limit the impact of the income tax, and it then allows people to see it as a fairer form of taxation. There are deductions that you can deduct from your income, standard deduction. You can also itemize your deductions, which you'll be doing certainly if you own a home and you pay a mortgage. You can deduct the interest you pay on that mortgage, which can be a very substantial deduction from your adjusted gross income. We also have tax credits that allow you to apply credits directly to the amount of tax that you owe to lower your tax liability. So we see the income tax used primarily at the federal level as well as at the state level. Then the third type of tax is a little bit different. A sales tax is a consumption-based tax. And as a consumption-based tax, instead of it being an ability to pay tax, it is a benefits received tax. So you are paying the tax based upon the benefits that you are getting from purchasing and consuming some type of a commodity. You can opt not to purchase that commodity. If you don't purchase the commodity, then you don't have to pay the sales tax. So it's a consumption-based tax. As a consumption-based tax, there is the potential that the sales tax can end up being highly regressive. And when we're looking at taxes, we always want to judge them based upon how progressive or regressive they are. A regressive tax would charge more taxation, a higher rate of taxation, to people who have less of an ability to pay the tax. A progressive tax will charge a higher tax rate to people who have more of an ability to pay the tax. So the graduated income tax system is seen as progressive because people who make more income typically, or should be, if you exclude all the loopholes, should be paying a higher percentage in taxation than people who generate less income. However, with a consumption-based tax, since you're basing it on the benefits that someone receives from consuming a commodity, it doesn't take into account the ability of someone to pay. So unless you have commodity exemptions, where you can exempt the staples of life from the sales tax is going to end up being very regressive. So you see a lot of states will have commodity-based exemptions, such as they will exempt pharmaceutical medication from the sales tax. They will exempt up to a certain amount of clothing from the sales tax. They'll exempt certain types of foodstuffs from the sales tax in order to make the sales tax a little bit more progressive in nature. There are two different types of sales taxes. There is a general sales tax, and then there's what's called a selective excise tax. A general sales tax will apply to the broad swath of commodities that are being transacted in a jurisdiction. So just about everything or most things will be subject to a general sales tax. Then a selective excise tax will tax different types of commodities differently. So for instance, you might have a luxury tax. So an example of a luxury tax could be a yacht tax. So if you purchase a tax, there's a special tax that's applied to that yacht purchase. The idea being that that will make it progressive because the people who are purchasing yachts are people who have more of an ability to pay. The problem with a luxury tax like a yacht tax is if you have a very high yacht tax, less affluent people will be purchasing yachts, less yachts will be sold. If less yachts are being sold, then less yachts will need to be produced. And then the people who are working in the shipyards making those yachts are then out of work because there's no longer a demand for those yachts. So you have to be very careful with how you target these types of luxury taxes. Another good example of a selective excise tax is what we call a sumptuary tax. A sumptuary tax is a sin tax. So a sumptuary or sin tax will be a tax placed upon tobacco products. If you use tobacco products, you pay the tax. If you don't use tobacco products, you do not pay the tax. The sumptuary taxes like tobacco taxes are sold based upon the idea that we can raise revenue and we can also discourage a behavior that's considered to be socially undesirable and unhealthy. The problem with that argument is you can't have it both ways. If you are truly going to discourage the consumption of tobacco products with this tobacco tax, you're probably not going to be raising a lot of revenue because demand for that tobacco product will go down. And as demand goes down, you generate less revenue. But sin taxes, sumptuary taxes, are very appealing to voters because it allows voters to engage in burden shifting. It allows them to shift the burden of the tax from themselves onto someone else. I don't use tobacco products, so I can shift the burden of taxation with the tobacco tax onto someone who does use tobacco products. We see sales tax used at the state level as well as at the local level. Here in California, we have local option sales taxes. That's why the sales tax you pay will depend upon the county in which you live. LA County sales tax is higher than Ventura County sales tax. The sales tax in the San Francisco Bay Area is higher than what it is in Los Angeles County. So it varies depending upon county. But property income and sales taxes are your primary vehicles of tax-based revenue. But as I said before, as a result of Proposition 13, local governments were able to derive less and less money from the local property tax. So what they did is they went out searching for other forms of revenue. And they found other forms of revenue in what are called non-tax forms of revenue. So things such as user charges and user fees. User charges will be revenue that comes from the charges that people pay for consuming some type of a service. So you consume a utility service. You pay a user charge for that utility service that generates revenue. So with a user charge, there's some type of a service that is being consumed that you can charge people for the amount that they are consuming. And that's called a user charge. Then there are user fees. User fees are different in that they are not usually tied to the consumption of any type of a service. Rather, user fees will be charged based upon the privilege of behaving in a certain type of way or engaging in a certain type of behavior. So you want to get a driver's license to drive a car. You have to pay a driver's license fee. You want to drive your car on the road. You have to pay a registration fee. You want to hunt. You have to purchase a hunting license and pay a license fee. You want to open up a franchise. You're going to have to pay a franchise fee to get that franchise license. So user fees are charged in order to try and guide or how to try and control how people engage in certain types of behaviors. User charges, however, are linked to the consumption of some type of a service. We have seen the shift toward user charges and user fees throughout California, especially in Northern and Central California. When you look at the average California city today generates more revenue from user fees and user charges than they do from property taxes. Now, here in Southern California, it's a little different. Southern California cities still tend to rely more on property taxes than their Northern California counterparts, but we have still seen this shift after Prop 13 away from property taxes and more toward these non-tax sources of revenue. So we've talked about expenditures, spending money in public budgets. We've talked about revenue, where we get the revenue from in order to make those expenditures. But what happens when there is an imbalance between our revenues and expenditures? That's what we refer to in public budgeting as a deficit. So in one given fiscal year, if your expenditures exceed your revenues, you have a deficit. Now, most state and local governments have a constitutional prohibition against running a deficit. The national government does not. And that's why every year since 1969, with the exception of 2 years, in the latter part, the end of the Clinton administration, beginning of the Bush administration, in those 2 years, we actually had a surplus. Other than those 2 years, every single year since 1969, the federal government has run a federal budget deficit, an imbalance between revenues and expenditures. And we have seen that budget deficit grow and grow over the years. Deficits, which are run at the federal level, are not supposed to be run at the state and local level. However, state and local governments can get around.
You going through the door or the window?
I'm sorry, someone's talking to me. Do the mute. State and local governments can get around this whole idea of a deficit by borrowing money. And it kind of sounds counterintuitive. But what the state or local government may do is, as they get close to the end of their fiscal year, and it looks like they are going to be in deficit spending, what they will do is they'll do some short-term borrowing of money. So they'll issue maybe what's called a revenue anticipation note or a tax anticipation note and borrow against the revenue that they are going to generate next fiscal year, and then use that money that they have borrowed in order to offset their operating deficit. So even though if a city is showing they don't have a deficit this year, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily fiscally healthy. It could be that they are borrowing money from a future year in order to avoid a deficit for this year. But technically, according to the California Constitution, state and local governments are not supposed to run these operating deficits. If you continue to run deficits year after year, like at the national level, the accumulation of those fiscal year deficits will then result in debt, and they will then contribute to the national debt. Debt comes in a couple of different varieties. There's long-term debt and there's short-term debt. Debt is essentially the borrowing of money. So we have to borrow money. We are issuing debt. We are issuing bonds. Long-term debt comes in the form of bonds. Short-term debt comes in the form of what are referred to as notes. Oops. My slides moved a little bit. Get back there. Okay. Long-term debt or bonds. Whenever a state or local government, or even the federal government, wants to borrow money, they will issue a bond. They will issue that bond, and then investors will purchase that bond. The proceeds from the purchase of that bond will then be used by the government either to construct a capital project like a city hall or a rec center or aquatic center, or could be used for perhaps the construction of a road, construction of connectors for roads, reconstruction of roads, bridge reconstruction, will be used typically for some capital project. They're essentially borrowing money paying that money back over a period of time in order to get a project done today. So if you're going to build a city hall, that city hall is probably going to last for hopefully maybe 70, 80, 100 years. So it's a very long-term, non-recurring type of project. But to get it built today, if you were going to raise tax rates enough in order to generate all those, the 80 or 90 million dollars in order to construct the building this year, it would be cost prohibitive for your voters. However, if you borrow the money and then repay that money over 20 or 30 or 40 years, that tax increase to repay that money in those principal and interest payments is much less of a burden for your taxpayers. So it just makes financial sense for governments to borrow money, issue these bonds in order to construct these long-term projects. So what types of bonds do governments tend to issue? The most common type of bond that is issued by a government is what's known as a general obligation bond. A general obligation bond will generate money that can be used for a variety of different purposes. So you can use it for your city hall, you can use it for your aquatic center. So there are a lot of purposes that this money can be used for. The drawback with a general obligation bond is that a general obligation bond will pledge what is called the full faith and credit of the city to repay that debt. So when the city issues a general obligation bond, it is guaranteeing its full faith and credit that it will do everything and anything at its disposal in order to repay this debt. So if it means they have to lay employees off, they will do that. If it means they have to cancel other projects, they will do that. If they have to defer preventive maintenance, they will do that. They will do whatever they need to do in order to repay this debt. So that's a very big guarantee on the part of the city. The good thing of that guarantee is that investors know they're getting their money back regardless of what happens. And you know, with investing, there's very much this relationship between risk and reward. The lower the risk, the lower the reward. The higher the risk, the higher the expected reward. Well, here, this is a very low risk investment for investors. So investors expect a low interest rate. They expect to get less money back than if it was a riskier investment, which means that these general obligation bonds will cost governments less money to issue than other types of more speculative debt. So they're less expensive to issue. However, you do have to pledge your full faith and credit. Another disadvantage with general obligation bonds is you usually have to get voter approval to pass these general obligation bonds. That voter approval in a lot of states, including here in California, is a supermajority. So you have to get a 2/3 majority of your voters in order to pass a general obligation bond. That is a very high threshold. Now, if you're a school district in California, I mentioned this earlier, you can use the Proposition 39 provisions, and that will allow you to pass it with only a 55% voter approval, but you still have to get these super majorities, which makes general obligation bonds sometimes difficult to issue. Another disadvantage of a general obligation bond is that states will place limitations on the amount of general obligation debt that a city or any type of local government can have. It's what's called your debt capacity. So they will limit the amount. And so if you are bumping up against your general obligation debt limitation, you're not going to have the flexibility to issue a general obligation bond, and you're going to have to look to another type of bond to issue. So in addition to general obligation bonds, another type of bond that we sometimes see issued is what's known as a revenue bond. A revenue bond is a more speculative type of investment for the investor. Because with a revenue bond, the city does not give its full faith and credit. So it doesn't give this blanket promise that the debt will be repaid regardless of what happens. Instead, the repayment of the debt is secured from the revenue that is generated from the operation of that enterprise. So we're going to build a recreation center, and we're going to charge people a fee to use that recreation center. will then capture all those fees that are paid in terms of revenue, and will use a portion of that revenue to then repay the investors with this revenue bond. So it's less exposure for the city, but the investors also have more risk because they don't have this blanket provision that they're going to get their money back. So we know the more risk, the more reward they're going to expect. So those investors are going to expect a higher interest rate. That higher interest rate means it's going to cost government more money to issue this revenue bond. So revenue bonds are much more costly than general obligation bonds. And they can only be used if the facility that's being constructed with the bond proceeds generates enough revenue to repay that debt, both the principal as well as interest payments. If the facility is not generating enough revenue, then you're not going to be able to use a revenue bond. The third type of debt, and we're not going to do a lot of these, you'll talk about a lot of these when you get to budgeting, but is a double barrel bond. And a double barrel bond is basically a combination of the best of both worlds. So in a double barrel bond, part of the bond issue will be general obligation in nature. So maybe 50% of the bond is general obligation, and then 50% is revenue. This is a bond that's good to use if the facility is not generating enough revenue to repay the entire debt, but it will generate enough to repay a portion of the debt. Then that portion of the bond becomes a revenue bond, and then the rest of the bond is more general obligation in nature. So a double barrel bond is a combination of the two. Since it's a combination of the two different types of bonds, the interest rate will be right in the middle of a general obligation rate and a revenue rate. It will be right in the middle between those two. So it's kind of a middle of the road expenditure for the government in repaying the principal and interest payments. There are a lot of other types of bonds that are used in municipal finance. There are capital appreciation bonds or CABs, zero coupon bonds. There are lease rental bonds. There are lease revenue bonds. There are sale leaseback bonds. There are all kinds of different bonds that local governments have thought up to try and give them more flexibility in how they borrow money. For our purposes, because we're a 500 class, we really only look at those three types: the general obligation, the revenue, and the double barrel bonds. When you get to 5C5, you'll talk about all those other types of bonds and their advantages and their disadvantages. But those bonds are for long-term borrowing of money. Long-term borrowing of money is defined as being more than 1 year in maturity. Typically, these bonds are 20, 30, or 40 years in maturity. Municipalities can also borrow money in a short-term type of nature, less than 1 year of maturity. Those are referred to as notes. So short-term debt are referred to as notes. They mature in less than a year, and they're usually used for the purpose of offsetting an imbalance between your revenues and expenditures. So like I said before, revenue anticipation note, a RAN, will be when the government will issue this debt and will secure the debt from the revenue that they're going to generate in the beginning part of the next fiscal year. So they anticipate this revenue. The anticipated revenue will be used to secure the debt. Same type of thing with a TAN, a tax anticipation note. So we'll use the anticipated tax revenue from next year to pay off this tax anticipation note. There are what are called GANs, which are grant anticipation notes. So if we assume we're going to be getting a grant next fiscal year, we can then use that grant proceed, the anticipated grant proceed, to secure a grant anticipation note. There are BANs, which are bond anticipation notes. And so if we know we're going to get proceeds from a long-term bond, we can then use that to secure a bond anticipation note so we can get started on our capital project today, and we don't have to sit around for 6 or 8 weeks waiting for the proceeds to come in from this long-term bond that we previously issued. So governments do a lot of this borrowing. Your ability to borrow money to issue debt will depend upon your credit rating. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch's are three of the primary credit rating agencies. Every time you go out there to issue a bond, one of those credit rating agencies you'll have to contract with in order to give you a credit rating. That credit rating will then determine how much interest you have to pay on that debt and how difficult that debt is to sell on the market. Better the credit rating, the cheaper the debt will be for you, as well as the easier the debt will be to sell. But you'll get into a lot of those discussions about what goes into a credit rating for a city when you get to your 555 class. But deficits and debt are realities of public budgeting at the national, state, as well as the local level. Well, to kind of wrap all this up, we know that we have a very difficult, very convoluted budget process at the federal level. We also know that that budget process is simply not working for us, and it hasn't been working for us for decades. We have trouble getting our budgets done on time. We have trouble bringing our budgets in alignment in terms of revenues and expenditures. We have trouble avoiding deficits. We have an ever-increasing national debt, and interest on that national debt continues every year to eat up more and more of our federal expenditures. Our national interest on the national debt is now consuming more than a third of all the money that the federal government spends each and every fiscal year. So this is all shorthand for saying we have a federal budget process that remains out of control. So the question then becomes, how have we tried to control it in the past, and how effective have these changes been? Well, you'll talk a lot more about this in 555, but three of the primary approaches that we have used in the past to try and gain control of the budgeting process. The first one came in the 1970s, and it was called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The purpose of the Budget and Impoundment Control Act was to control the process by which budgets were created. So this is, as we said before, where we created things such as a congressional budget office, a budget committee in the House and the Senate, the idea of a budget resolution to try and place some fiscal discipline on Congress in terms of how much money it is spending. Also in this Budget Impoundment Control Act, we ended up with some impoundment controls placed upon the president. And I mention that because that has become important in this current administration over the past month. We've seen the Trump administration refuse to spend money that was appropriated by Congress. That is what's known as a rescission. So he's rescinding that money and saying, I am not going to spend that money. Technically, that is something that was prohibited under the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. All presidents could really do is defer spending for a temporary period of time. Now this whole idea of rescissions and refusing to spend money that was appropriated by Congress, this Budget and Impoundment Control Act, this is now being challenged in the courts. So I currently do not have an answer for you in terms of the president's ability to defy these impoundment controls. That's something we are going to find out once the Supreme Court chimes in on what's been going on. But this is all an attempt by Congress to try and make itself a co-equal with the president and to gain some control over the budget process to allow us to get budgets done on time and to hopefully add some rhyme and reason to the budget process. Fast forward to the mid-1980s. By the mid-1980s, the budget process was still out of control. We were still not getting the budget done on time, and we were still running deficits every single year, and every year those deficits were getting bigger and bigger. So clearly, a lot of the things we tried to do in the Budget and Impoundment Control Act simply did not work. So in 1985, we get this piece of legislation that, in very common terms, has been called the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act. And it was called Graham-Rudman-Hollings, named after the three co-sponsors of the bill, Phil Graham, Warren Rudman, and Fritz Hollings. And they're all represented here on the screen for you. Phil Graham, a conservative Republican from Texas. Ernest Hollings, Fritz Hollings on the right, a Democrat from South Carolina. And back then in the 1980s, there were Democrats in Congress from South Carolina. And the person in the middle, Warren Rudman, was more of a mainstream independent from New Hampshire. So he very much had a bipartisan piece of legislation. And the purpose of Graham-Rudman-Hollings was to try and control deficits, to try and get a handle on the idea of Congress being unable to balance the revenues and expenditures. So the primary reform that we get out of Graham-Rudman-Hollings was to come up with a timetable for deficit reduction. So every year we created a maximum allowable deficit. And every year that maximum allowable deficit target would get smaller and smaller and smaller until in the out years, eventually it would be zero and we would not have a deficit. So logically, it made a lot of sense. As long as Congress adhered to those maximum deficit targets, eventually we would be out of the deficit hole. Problem, obviously, was that Congress did not adhere to those deficit targets. Congress made the law until Congress felt it could just ignore the law. So every year we missed the deficit target, and Congress just revised the timetable and increased those deficit targets. Then the next year they missed the deficit target again, and then increased the target for the next year, and so on and so on. Instead of deficits going down, deficits actually went up. So the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act really did not work very well. And there were two versions of it. There's Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 and Graham-Rudman-Hollings 2, 2 years later. So one in 1985 and one in 1987. The reason why we had a second one in 1987 is not just because the first one didn't work, but because the first one was unconstitutional. Every now and then, Congress will get a little bit ahead of itself, and it will pass laws that violate the Constitution. And Graham-Rudman-Hollings 1 violated the Constitution. We won't get into all the weeds on it, but essentially what it did is it placed the Comptroller General of the United States in charge of watching the president as the president cut the budget. Problem with that is the Comptroller General of the United States technically serves Congress, and that was a violation of separation of powers. And so they had to undo that with a revised version 2 years later in Graham-Rudman-Hollings 2. Fast forward to the 1990s. So in the 1990s, we've had these two major budget reforms that have not worked. We are still not getting our budgets done on time, and we are still operating with deficits. So we end up getting this thing called the Budget Enforcement Act. The Budget Enforcement Act said instead of focusing squarely on deficits, instead we're going to focus on spending. And so what it did is it created three different categories of spending: domestic spending, defense spending, and international spending. So three different categories. And then they placed what they call firewalls between each category, meaning that if you wanted to spend more on a domestic program, you couldn't do that by spending less on a defense program. You couldn't rob from one category to give to another category. So it was meant to try and impose some fiscal discipline on Congress. It also introduced something known as PAYGO. And PAYGO is an acronym that stands for Pay As You Go. PAYGO required that if Congress wanted to spend more money on a program, it would have to pay for it either with new revenue or by reducing spending on another program within that same category. You could not increase spending by borrowing money. So you had to pay for all the increased spending by normally decreasing spending on other programs. So you pay as you go along. PAYGO has kind of been here and there in Congress. It made a return to the Senate a couple of years ago. It kind of is something that the Senate uses when it's convenient and then disregards when it's inconvenient. So they use it for political reasons. But the Budget Enforcement Act, along with the Balanced Budget Acts of 1993 and 1997, eventually by fiscal year 1999, helped give us a surplus. And for two fiscal years, in 1999 and 2000, the federal government actually, at least on paper, had more revenue than it was spending. And those are the only 2 years that that's happened since 1969. Not only was the surplus a result of the success of the Budget Enforcement Act and the Balanced Budget Act, it was also the result of a very quickly growing economy. So in the 1990s, we had the dot-com boom. And so we had all the internet that was growing at exponential rates. All of these internet companies that were really making money hand over fist. And that was a huge influx of revenue into the federal government. The combination of that influx of revenue and the fiscal discipline that was imposed on spending by the Budget Enforcement Act, the combination of those two things ended up giving us a surplus. Then we had the events of September 11th, and we had the war on terrorism, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and we went right back into deficit spending because of that. I think the moral of the story here, in terms of public budgeting, is the only way to avoid deficits is with political willpower. You can change your process all you want. You can put in all the different processes and all the different rules and regulations you want to put in. Those rules and regulations can always be ignored. In order to truly bring the budget into alignment and to make sure that you're avoiding running a deficit, it's going to take political willpower. the willpower either to have very stringent cuts to the amount of money you're spending, or the political willpower to find new sources of revenue. And until you have more revenue and fewer expenditures, it's just commonsensical that you're not going to be able to avoid deficits. And we have seen the federal government fail to avoid deficits. We are now in fiscal year 2025, and we've only done it twice since 1969. So it's a very poor track record, to say the least. But this is meant to give you a brief introduction into public budgeting and the management of fiscal resources in the public sector. It also is meant to give you the information that you need to address that public budgeting scenario on the final assessment. So at this point, you now have all the information that you need in order to do a good job on the fiscal assessment, final assessment. You also have all the information you need at this point, hopefully, to give you a good launching point into the MPA program. So we've kind of foreshadowed all of your core courses, whether it be public budgeting, human resource management, organization theory, policy analysis, research methods / program evaluation. Hopefully this is giving you a good foundation, a good baseline to then move forward and be successful throughout the remainder of the program. At this point, I then had a breakout room exercise. I know we're pushing 9 o'clock, and so I don't really think we have time to do justice to a breakout room exercise. So instead of doing the breakout room exercise, we'll spend the last few minutes together tonight. Do you have any questions, or are there any clarifications on any of the information we've covered tonight on the management of human resources or the management of fiscal resources? Also, any questions at all about your final Canvas essay number 5, which is due by midnight on Saturday, or those scenarios on the final assessments? Since we have been successful at covering all of our information by 9 o'clock tonight, we do not need to have a Zoom session on Saturday, March the 8th. So I will give that time back to you on Saturday to work on your Canvas essay number 5, as well as to work on the final assessment. I will be available all week as well as all day on Saturday via email. So as you are working on the final assessment, if you have any questions at all on the final assessment, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any of those questions for you. From this point, once you get those 2 assignments done by midnight on March the 8th, you then have a couple of weeks on a break, and then you'll be moving into your next course, which I believe is PPA 577 with Dr. Martin, looking at human resource management. That course begins on Saturday, March the 22nd. I will make sure that that syllabus and your required textbooks will get out to you. Your list of required textbooks will get out to you as soon as possible, and I'll try and get Dr. Martin to get those out to you by the end of next week. Fingers crossed, no promises, because I know he's got a lot of other things he's working on, but I will try to get that out to you by next week. Let's see, if we didn't pay for our second course just yet, will we get an email to pay that prior to the next class? You should get an email from Matt. He should be in the process of registering everyone for 577 in the very near future. And so you should be able to get an email from him as a reminder to pay for that class. Because some folks register for both up at front. Some people do one at a time. And so if you haven't registered yet, you'll get an email from Matt. If you don't hear from Matt about a week before the class begins, reach out to him, send him an email, include me as a CC on that email, and we'll make sure that we get it all taken care of for you. Okay. Let's see. Make sure we do not have class on Saturday. That's correct. We do not have class on Saturday. And the way in which we have the agreement we came to with D1DA is that you were in the D1DA program. You had to opt out for this class, but not for classes moving forward. So you should not be in the D1DA program for the 577 class. If you find yourself that you are, for some reason, that class is opted in, which it shouldn't be, you'll be able to opt out within the first 2 weeks of the class. And so within 2 weeks of March 22nd, you would be able to opt out. But you shouldn't have to, because the cohort should not be opted in to any courses in the future for D1DA. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure working with you. I look forward to reading your final assessments and getting your final grades uploaded, and then you can move onward and upward in the program and move on to human resource management. So Take care, everyone. Have a great week, and I'm sure I will be seeing you again in the very near future. So take care.
Thank you, doctor. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Powell.
Thanks, everyone.